Hi, gorgeous. Oh yeah, that's totally you. So how are you doing today? I hope you're having a great day. My name is Sarah Labarre and today is Wednesday, which means it's time to get crafty with me. Every Wednesday I sit down and I show you a craft that I've been working on. Last week I finally finished my red Serena gown. It took me about a month and a half to do that, which I divided in 3 videos, all of which are available on my channel. This week I am working on one of my husband's Christmas gifts. Qu'est-ce que tu veux? Tu y as été dehors là. Hein? So I never know what to give my husband for birthdays or Christmases because, you know, when he wants something he just goes and buys it. And for a couple of years now, for Christmas and birthdays, I have been sewing stuff for him. Last year he asked me for a bathrobe, and this year he has asked me to reproduce this shirt for him. This is a shirt that he had custom made a few decades back. He has about a dozen of these shirts, but they're getting old. The sleeves are getting kind of musty and gross. So he has asked me, qu'est-ce que tu fais? So he has asked me to take one apart and reproduce the pattern and make him new shirts. So this is what I'm gonna do this week. It's not so much a tutorial as it is, I think, a method. I know this is gonna fit him because this was custom made. Pardon? I can't film today. It's like either there's a really needy doggo or like the freaking Canadian Army's gone out and exploding cannons and stuff. So yeah, I know this is gonna fit him because he has had that. So yeah, custom made, fits him. He's a very small. Je t'aime. Ben oui, je t'aime. Yeah, I think the universe is trying to send me a message, and that message is get to work, bish.
I'm sorry about that. Our village and army officials do send us regular statements as to approximately when they'll be performing their exercises, but unless you have inside contacts, you really can't know exactly when that will be. Usually they tell us between said date and said date they'll be performing said exercise using said caliber, not specifying at what time of the day or night this is scheduled to happen. The morning I was filming this, they were in all likelihood using a 155mm towed howitzer, which packs a pretty intense punch. Back to our sewing room now. So my plan is to rip this whole garment apart and trace all the pieces onto craft paper to make a pattern. As I had never made a men's shirt before, the construction process looked very confusing to me, so to make sure that I remembered exactly where my seam lines were supposed to be, I marked all of them with a Sharpie. This way I'll be able to distinguish the top stitching and the flat felling stitches from the actual seam lines. Then comes the long and tedious job of ripping the whole garment apart. Honestly, this is a pain in the arse. A seam ripper, especially the cheap one I got, will only take you so far. When taking a somewhat older garment apart, the fabric has become more easily friable, and it's very easy to pull too hard and just tear a piece in two. It happened to me at a few places, but I still managed to get everything separated and ready to trace. So the first pattern piece to come out was the collar, and before tracing each pattern piece, I'm giving it a good press and I'm examining it thoroughly, making mental notes about the construction process, the size of the seam allowances, the layering, etc. I'm then laying the piece on my roll of craft paper, holding it in place with a few pattern weights, or in my case a few tiny boxes, and I'm tracing it with pencil. At some point, I realized that I had to trim the seam allowance to get to the true seam lines, which I did. I'm then using my French curve to true up my curves, then I end up with a first draft for my collar piece. Before I'm ready to start cutting fabric though, I need to make the pieces symmetrical. This shirt is at least 20 years old and it's got a lot of wear, so the pieces will have warped over time. This particular piece, though, was surprisingly symmetrical, perhaps due to the double layer of fusible interfacing that's been holding it tight. I'm adding relevant information, such as the grain line and the color tip placement. Some of the color layers are folded into sort of a pocket in which you can insert color stays, which are the little, usually white plastic pointy bits that you can often find in store-bought shirts. I'm writing down the placement of those little pockets on my main pattern piece, and to make sure that they're symmetrical, I'm folding the piece in two at the center, and I'm tracing it with the Sharpie slowly enough for the ink to bleed through to the layer underneath. And then I'm tracing just the extremity of this piece to serve as the color tip piece. There are two main layer bunches on this collar. The one next to the skin is a stiff double interfaced piece. The outer fashion layer and one layer of fusible interfacing have a 1/4 inch seam allowance all around, while the other layer of fusible interfacing has no seam allowance. For this reason, I decided to trace my pattern without seam allowance and to add those manually when cutting my fabric. The layer bunch that's away from the skin is a single layer of fashion fabric, but it's folded diagonally and the color tips are added, thus forming the pockets for the color stays. Both the color and the tips have a 1/4 inch seam allowance. The next piece to be unpicked, drafted, made symmetrical and then labeled is the color stand. This too is comprised of two main layers. One is a single fashion layer with a 1/4 inch seam allowance all around except at the bottom, which has 5/8 of an inch. The other layer is the same, except it's got fusible interfacing. The fusible interfacing has a 1/4 inch seam allowance all around except the bottom, where it has no seam allowance at all. Next, the yoke. This one had really warped, so I folded my shape in two, trimmed some bits to make kind of an average between the two outlines, and used that on another bit of folded paper, tracing it slowly with the Sharpie to make sure it bleeds through. For a shirt, I need 2 layers of yoke. The neckline and the arm's eye bits have a 1/4 inch seam allowance, while the shoulder seams and the bottom seam have a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Off camera, to avoid being too redundant, I traced my front panel. And this is the back panel I'm drafting now. To get the darts on my paper, I simply dotted it slowly with my Sharpie until it bled through all around. This allowed me to connect the dots and build my dart shape. I could have made only a half panel piece for this one and cut it on the fold. However, I prefer marking my pattern pieces on a single layer of fabric, especially with stripy or checkered fabric. Therefore, I'm doubling my panel using the good old Sharpie method. This piece has a 1/2 inch seam allowance all around except the arm's eyes, where it's at a 1/4 inch. Next, I need a sleeve. This was drafted the same way as the other pattern pieces, except this one I didn't have to make symmetrical. But I did have to mark the pleats, the grain lines, as well as the slit line, where the sleeve placket will be at in the end. This pattern piece has a 1/2 inch seam allowance on the bottom and a 3/4 of an inch at the top. And when you're putting a shirt together, you attach the sleeve to the arm's eyes, and then you attach the side seams. I'm planning my side seams as flat felled seams, so the front panels as well as the front part of the sleeve have a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and the back panels and the back side of the sleeve have a 1/2 inch seam allowance. We're pretty close to the end now, with only 2 little pieces to draft. The next one is the sleeve cuff. It's pretty straightforward, and I ended up having to make this one more symmetrical. Each cuff is comprised of 2 layers. One is a single layer of fashion fabric with a 1/4 inch seam allowance all around except the bottom, where it's at a 1/2 inch. The other one is the same, except it needs to be interfaced. The interfacing has no seam allowance. There's only one pattern piece left for me to draft, and that's the sleeve placket. That's the little pointy strips that's hiding and protecting the sleeve slit. At that point, I didn't fully understand how on earth you're supposed to sew a sleeve placket, so I gave the fabric piece a good press and reproduced the whole thing on paper, folds, slits and all. Some of those lines weren't especially relevant, but it doesn't really matter. You'll probably get to see me sew a shirt in a future video, so I'll properly explain sleeve plackets then. In about 2 days' work, I managed to unrip and trace the whole shirt. There's a total of 9 different pattern pieces to this garment. Here's the front panel. I've written the grain line as well as the seam allowance information on each different seam. As you can see, I've noted the 3 inches seam allowance to be added at the center front as to accommodate for a placket for buttons and buttonholes. Here's the back panel. It's a double panel and it has all the relevant info: darts, grain lines, seam allowances, etc. The third pattern piece of 9 is the sleeve. It's got a lot of info: grain line, seam allowances, pleat lines, and then there's this slit line that's designed to lay under the sleeve placket. I also like to label the front part of the sleeve as well as its back part because, for now at least, there are no notches to be matched on my pattern and sleeves can be confusing. Next comes the yoke. That's the top-back part of the shirt over the shoulder blades. All the relevant info has been added: grain line, how many pieces to cut, seam allowances. Next comes the cuff with all the relevant information. And then my 6th piece on 9 is the collar. This piece has a lot of info written on it. Apart from the usual quantities, grain line and seam allowances, it's got the folds marked out as well as the seam placement for the shirt stays pockets. Next comes the collar tip. It's got the same seam allowances as the main collar, except it doesn't have any folds or pocket seam lines. The 8th pattern piece out of 9 is the collar stand, shown here with the relevant information. And my final pattern piece is the sleeve placket. I've got a whole men's shirt pattern now, one that's custom made to fit my husband. He's a very small and slim man, so most store-bought shirts are too large for him, even the extra smalls. So yeah, maybe there's no magic in his Christmas gift, but it's a piece of heritage that he'll be carrying with him and that he'll be using for the rest of his life. He even chose his fashion fabrics himself because this is a man who knows how to dress and who knows his preferences, so there will be absolutely no surprise, but I know for a fact that whatever garment I make him will be to his taste, and I know that he really appreciates the effort that I put into making him whatever he asks for. I'd like to thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please give it a big thumbs up. You can subscribe to this channel and turn on the notifications for more crafty time with me. And you can check out my Instagram at GallicAnglicae_Regina. Until next time, please drink plenty of water. Please help each other make it through a very lonely Christmas. And please be kind to yourself. I will see you next Wednesday. Bye!
And today is Wednesday, which means it's time to get... C'est quoi ces manières-là?